And there's a few things I want to dive into as far as your own study goes. And one has emerged as one of my absolute favorite things to talk about on the show. We've talked about it quite a bit, even more in this last year as more research is being done. You've obviously done a case study about this, but eating disorders and metabolic therapies, we're getting more data around this, including, again, some of the case studies that you have published, and other researchers out there. Can you tell us kind of some of the ideas around using metabolic therapies for things like eating disorders that might seem counterintuitive in the beginning?
Oh, absolutely. So, um, yeah, like you're saying for mental health, we're so fortunate that we have, the Bazooki group that's funding, studies on bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. And basically, when you look at any type of mental health disorder, I like to link it to like epilepsy, right? Because epilepsy, babies are born with it. They're not, they didn't do anything wrong. They didn't have like a, bad diet in the mother's womb or whatever. But and all epilepsy is just a genetic abnormality in the brain where, when the individual or the child has glucose, the brain does not process glucose or sugar very well. So they have a seizure. And often what happens is you give the baby or the person a ketogenic diet. So now their brain is being fueled off free fatty acids and ketones and they stop seizing. It's like that for whatever reason, their brains just don't metabolize glucose very well. It's like if you had a car and you put the wrong fuel in it, you wouldn't be shocked like, oh my God, it's not running. Well, yeah, it can't, you have to put the right fuel in. And so, like Dr. Sethi Shabani, she wrote a case study on, binge eating disorder, and what they were finding is when they took people off the standard American diet, took people off the, eat whatever you want, sugar in moderation, and put them on these low carbohydrate diets, they did incredibly well. And like you said, it's almost blasphemy in the dietetics world to say, hey, you have an eating disorder, you have a unhealthy, dysfunctional relationship with food, but we're going to restrict this food group. Because on the surface, it sounds like, oh my God, no, you can't do that. You can't restrict somebody with binge eating disorder, certainly anorexia, they're really underweight. You can't tell them not to eat carbohydrates or not to eat a food group. But as opposed to looking at it like that, well, how we have looked at it, and I think what's been really successful, is we look at it, how does this impact my hormones? Like how does protein, how does meat, how do eggs impact my hormones? How does oatmeal, cereals, bread, how does that impact my hormones? Canola oil, coconut oil, butter, how do those things? When you look at it like that, if you have a particular food group that has an incredibly negative impact on your, hormones, and specifically looking here at like insulin, why would you consume that? Why would you consume something that is directly causing a negative impact on blood glucose and insulin, not allowing your brain to function, and potentially exacerbating your disease? Because if you just took it out like that, people would be like, oh, of course, I would never want to eat something like that. But what we found is that often, just like we talked about a second ago, people are eating so many carbohydrates throughout the day. And even people who are under eating, who come from a background of anorexia, often their hunger signals are completely out of whack and their body is overproducing insulin. They're trying to get whatever nutrition they consume into the bloodstream quickly. And so for those people eating a lot of, cereals and granola bars and carbohydrates, they can feel, almost euphoric initially and then crash really hard. And that's a scary feeling. One, of course I've been there. And two, that's really not a good long-term sustainable solution, even from like a health and, macronutrient, proteins, vitamin and mineral wise. So yeah, the paper that I wrote, we just looked at 3 people who had very long periods. We're talking like over, 10 years of recovery and from an eating disorder, and living and eating a ketogenic or carnivore diet. So a very high fat, high protein, and very low carbohydrate diet. And they reported, they gain weight, they feel strong, they're mentally stable. And that certainly isn't me here saying like, oh my gosh, everyone with an eating disorder has to follow a ketogenic or carnivore diet. I often work with people who we use that as a tool to really help heal your metabolism. Like, let's stabilize your blood glucose. Let's, get you to where you can oxidize fatty acids. And then from there, they often will build their diet out because, I'm not anti-carbohydrate. A lot of people, I shouldn't say a lot, but metabolically healthy people can tolerate, carbohydrates. It depends on your life and your goals. But, our current system is just awful. We take people who are either in periods of severe starvation or have been binging and purging, and we throw just unlimited amounts of sugar and things to them. And then we're surprised when their body and brain are on fire. So yeah, that's kind of what the research is showing, that just get the blood sugar stable, let the body and brain run on both, be able to be metabolically flexible where they can run on both fat and ketones. And then that also helps, the brain function.
Yeah. Wow. One of our former guests, Carolyn Beckwith, I'm not sure if you're familiar with her,
Oh
her
yeah,
story.
yeah.
She really opened my eyes to kind of what the treatment is actually like when you go to these inpatient or outpatient centers. How it's exactly what you mentioned. Like the people that you knew in those treatment centers, they could have been there their second time, their third time, their fourth time. Like people are relapsing, and the kind of counseling that you're given, as far as I understand it, is you're trying to be accepting of all foods. Like if you have a somewhat of an orthorexic view of food and you are not never going to eat cookies, you're supposed to like hold the cookie and smell the cookie and taste the cookie and that kind of thing. And it just, the failure rate of treatment seems to be absolutely terrible in the conventional system. And that sounds like somewhat of what you experienced, correct?
Oh, absolutely. Like there's a fantastic article written about specifically about anorexia that talked about how it was called a crisis in care, and how people would go into treatment, gain weight rapidly, come out of treatment, lose weight rapidly, go back into treatment, and the cycle would continue. And they said these people are getting sicker, because obviously that affects your bones and muscles. Financially, it bankrupts you, it bankrupts families. It certainly caused my family a lot of financial distress. And then you just feel like you're a failure. It mentally destroys you. Where in reality, like you said, you're potentially feeding people these substances their bodies just can't tolerate. Once again, if you put diesel fuel in your regular car and you're just like, I can't believe it's not working, it's like, no, just put the right fuel in and it will work very well. But our current nutrition guidelines insist that we have to feed people these very high carbohydrate diets. And like you said, with the cookie thing, is ridiculous. I specifically remember when I was 12, that was actually the last year, that this is in the 90s, that the facility I was at, we had both adults and children. Now all facilities legally are separated. So, it wasn't uncommon to be in therapy sessions with someone much older, or, group things. And I remember we were going into one of those really goofy, oh, it's a challenge, everybody's going to eat a cookie. And I remember one of the adults like grabbed me and she was like, when they ask you if you're anxious, you say no. Do you understand me? I was like, why? They're like, say no, say you're happy, say. She was like, we all want to get the fuck out of here. So it was like, you need to lie so everyone thinks you're okay. So
Wow.
it's like, I mean, this is, it's funny what now as an adult, I'm like, oh my God, so inappropriate to do to a child. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of, from what I understand, it's very similar as far as, forcing people to eat these highly processed, high sugar foods and pretend that everything's fine.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And so this is going to be purely speculative to ask you to time travel back to where you were, 12 years old, 13 years old, 14 years old. If somebody knew about this kind of stuff and presented this as an option, again, a lot of moving parts, pure speculation. Part of this has to do with, your family and what they were choosing to eat. You don't have full autonomy. But if somebody told you you could have walked away from your eating disorder by eating a stricter, call it a ketogenic diet or metabolic, therapeutic kind of a diet, do you think you would have accepted that or at least been willing to try?
Oh, 100%. Because I
100%.
specifically like being in like the year after, because after I got out of treatment, did okay for a little bit, then lost quite a bit of weight. And I remember being in a therapist's office and just crying and saying, I will eat whatever you tell me to. I just don't want to feel so bad. Because I would go a few hours through the day and just like start to sweat and get shaky. Because once again, my body was so insulin. It would be my hypothesis, my insulin was high. I would crash really hard. Where, when I wouldn't eat, I didn't. I was just, once again, I wasn't taking in sugar. So my blood sugar was stable. But if someone had said, hey, we can do the same thing, you can have stable blood sugar, your anxiety is going to be better, you're just going to eat a lot of protein and fat. And of course, I know I still had lots of fears around meat and fat. That certainly isn't uncommon for people with eating disorders. But I think if somebody had said, I'm going to explain it to you and let's just experience it for a few days, I absolutely would have been in on that. And I think most people
Wow.
would.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, the numbers It's really scary with anorexia in particular. How many people don't survive? I know you wrote about that in your book and shared a beautiful poem of somebody who didn't make it out. And you yourself were given, I believe it was like a 10% chance that you'd even make it out. Like those are really scary numbers, and it's. I don't even know if it's something you will ever like walk away from fully in your life, but it seems much more manageable for a lot of people when they address it with the diet and run their brains on ketones, you know?
I agree. Yeah, 1,000%. And yeah, the statistics are horrible. And I mean, and I often think when I see statistics, I'm like, it's probably even worse than that. You know, it's probably worse than what we think. But it right now, it's about 20% of people with anorexia, don't survive. And then, it was like another 20 to 25% are going to be in and out of the hospital their whole life, doing that, get a little better, lose weight. And then there's a pretty high percentage of suicide. It just
Yeah.
start to feel hopeless and helpless. It's like you're doing everything that you're supposed to do, yet, you feel miserable, you feel sick and scared, and your brain is running a million miles an hour. It makes it very hard to hold down a job, to have any type of social life. So, yeah, I absolutely agree.